So my name's Vicky Hurd. I'm taking over from Tony in terms of chairing today, because I think he felt he was overburdened, which is probably quite true. He's got a lot to do today. I'm the farm campaign coordinator at Sustain, which is an alliance of 100 organisations, NGOs, public interest groups, some of which represented here. And the topic that we're talking about today is around land use, the future of land use. What is land for? And Tony, in his wisdom, and he's just walked in, set the group the task of, in 2 minutes, answering the question, what is the optimal use of Britain's land area and how do we achieve it? So no big task in a 2-minute session. Obviously, this is a crucial topic. Ruth alluded to it yesterday. I've worked on this area for a long time. There's so many elements of policy, consumer action, business action that come into this. There's a lot of areas, but we'll try and have a good discussion afterwards. So I'm going to keep them to 2 minutes, and I think we're just going to kick straight off, if you're all right with that. Yeah? Derek, if you could go first. You've got 2 minutes.
Okay, right, I come from a farming background. My great-grandfather was the first person to sell a ram for over £1,000 in Scotland 100 years ago. So my background's farming. The idea that we need to farm all of Britain to save the world and save ourselves is quite patently ridiculous. The industry has now become a basket case, and for very many small to medium-sized farmers, were it not for the subsidies involved, they would not be able to retain businesses, and those businesses would not be functional in any case. The idea that we have to improve landscapes by creating corridors is of course true, but if you're trying to create corridors to enable biodiversity to move, you have to have biodiversity in the first place to use those corridors. And guys, there is very little life left out there. I don't know what brochures you look at, hair sitting in furrows, but the curlews that come to my farm maybe once or twice every 3 or 4 years are the last birds dying from the old populations that were in the culm. When they rise skittling from the fields, they are maybe 17 or 18 years old, and in another 4 or 5 years, those single birds won't come anymore because they're dead. There's nowhere for them to breed, they're all gone. So if we're looking at corridors, we're going to have to create wildlife-rich environments to restore wildlife so that things can move. We're going to have to be imaginative. Maybe we need to think about deregulating the use of carcasses so that wild bulls can lie out there and in their splendor, and by dying and providing nutrients, they can feed the vultures that will come. We need to think about the other species that can't come, species that are either extinct or too far away from the areas where we want them to be, and that means species like water voles that have declined from 1.2 million in 2002 to less than 100,000 now. But it might also mean tree frogs, which abandoned Britain in the 16th century. We also need to look at trying species, so it's not all just cozying up to a few dormice here, a few dragonflies there. It's looking at things that take something from us, like white-tailed eagles and golden eagles. We need to look at the regeneration of the rural economy, but perhaps we need to spend that money more effectively on doing things that are innovative. Like, for example, taking stored gallery products from some of your national collections out to sites in the wider landscape to encourage people to go out and see and spend money in the economies there.
Time's up.
And I'd just like to say one thing about changing attitudes, and I'm going to because we've heard a lot about law and a lot about legality and a lot about what we can do on our watch. And one of the scandals there still is in this landscape is the killing of the great raptorial birds. Okay. It is wrong. We need to pass legislation, and if we can't do carrot, we need to do stick on this issue. Okay,
thank you. Over to you, Tim.
Well, yeah, what a follow. I too used to be a farmer, but probably not as good a farmer as you do, which is why I'm not farming anymore. But I want to just take a step back before we go forward. I want to think about Brexit, and I want to think about people's reaction to it, because I found it fascinating. To generalise massively, we had an environmental movement which was very concerned about Brexit, and we had, for reasons that I still don't understand, a farming community which the majority of farmers voted for it. The reaction of the two sides has been very interesting. I think the conservation movement, the environmental movement immediately saw opportunity, and it is driving that opportunity. I worry about the farming community, I worry about the engagement, and as I'll come on to in a minute, I worry about the fact that we seem to be travelling on parallel and disconnected routes at the moment. The reaction of the environmental movement to to the Brexit vote, I think, was summed up really by Ruth in that last session, where she talked about the problems of CAP. The one thing, a Liberal Democrat conference last year, the only thing you could ever get a Liberal Democrat to criticise the EU about is about CAP. Whichever side, wherever you come from in this debate, CAP has been a problem, and there is, of course, a massive potential to do something considerably better. But when we do that, I come from a position, my membership, my constituency, whereas there is one species which is critical, and that's the human species. And we have to understand that if we're going to move forward towards goals which we can all agree on, then the sustainability of communities and the sustainability of the rural economy, and that means profit and that means productivity as well as biodiversity conservation benefit, has to be part of that debate. And far too often it is not. And I do not believe we'll get to a successful solution until we've got there. And I think really that is the biggest issue we have to resolve. And it's unfortunately not going to be resolved in this conference, because I see a lot of very committed conservationists, environmentalists, and I see a very few farmers. And at the moment, we seem to be having these two separate debates. And from a farming perspective, it's about profitability, it's about productivity, lots of reference to the Treasury. Okay. And then I see DEFRA and this conference here. Okay. So let's try and resolve that.
Quick poll, how many farmers in the room? Quite a few. I look forward to hearing from you later. Okay, over to... Starting again. Sorry, just because it's quite useful. It's my egg time. Thank you. Yeah, James.
Okay, thank you. It's quite a question to which there probably isn't a single objective answer, but I think there are some kind of underlying principles that need to underpin all this, namely that a sustainable environment is the basis of our prosperity and essential for the health and well-being of society. And to achieve that, we've got to act for nature's recovery and deliver a healthier environment. And in terms of delivering a healthier environment, I had a very inspiring start to this week, where we had the first planting of the first trees of the new Northern Forest, which is going to bring a much-needed green dimension to the Northern Powerhouse project. 50 million trees over 25 years, kick-started by 5.7 million from DEFRA. And that's all about integrating the benefits of trees and woods within the kind of wider economic and social agenda there. And those are two key words, really, integration and fragmentation. For too long, our approach to woods and trees and to nature generally has been fragmented. The operation of the CAP has often excluded woods and trees from being part of a more integrated approach to land management. It separated farmers and non-farmers and town from country. So we want to see a sustainable land use policy that looks at land management in the round. And for me, I think we need to act on the ever more compelling evidence base around the benefits of woods and trees. The bedrock of that is proper protection of our ancient woodland heritage and acting boldly about woodland creation and recognising there's a really strong evidence base out there, and revisiting the report of the Bishop of Liverpool, which called for 15% woodland cover by 2060 and had a wide range of stakeholders there. So just to finish, so what we need is a new integrated approach to land management with public benefit at its heart, and we need that to be underpinned by world-leading environmental legislation put in place before, not after, we leave the EU. And I think if we can reshape land use policy in a really imaginative way and be a world leader in delivering a healthier environment, it can be an incredibly unifying force and bring people together during quite a turbulent time in our post-war history.
Thank you. Oh, good timing. Phil.
Thank you, Vicky. Philip Limbury, Compassion in World Farming. To achieve optimal use of our land, I think we need to move away. We need systemic change and move away from the biggest driver in declines of our natural capital and the biggest cause of animal cruelty in the country, which is industrial agriculture, factory farming, keeping animals caged, crammed and confined, and feeding them half of our cereal crops, not to mention vast amounts of soya, palm and fish meal drafted in from around the world. How can we achieve this? By moving away from industrial agriculture, stop it, it's not a good thing, and utilise the rich pastures that we have in Britain. Britain is one of the most agricultural landscapes in the world. 2/3 of that landscape is pasture, yet the majority of our farm animals are reared indoors. Those two things do not add up, cannot add up into the future. How do we get there? Well, I think government needs to come behind systemic change. It's refreshing, hugely refreshing, to hear Michael Gove talking in terms of public money for public goods. Part of those goods is not just environmental credentials, but also the deliverance of animal welfare friendly food too. Putting animals in conditions where they can exercise their natural behaviours, fresh air, sunshine, running, stretching, playing, all of these things they can do on pasture. Public money for public goods is one way. Public procurement, a move towards that is another way. At the moment, government public procurement has lower standards than McDonald's. Another aspect here is also to get consumers involved through honest labelling according to method of production. All of these things and more working together will bring us to an optimal land use. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you. Coming back to the original question, optimal land use, and given our take globally, that's what we've got to bear in mind in this discussion. It's not just about how we do the UK and what happens with the command paper. It's the wider trading environment and what we consume. So we've had discussion of wildlife and rewilding and thinking about space for biodiversity, also space for farmers' engagement, farmers involved in the discussion about the forestry role, getting to a target of a large amount of forest cover in the UK for all the benefits that brings. What does that mean for land use? And then finally talking about livestock, impacts of livestock. And it is fair to say that we probably most people in this room recognise the huge amount of land devoted to livestock production globally, and increasingly. And we import a huge amount of that. So, for quite different perspectives, some answering the question, some partly answering the question, over to you. I think it'd be great if you could introduce yourselves as you I'm waiting for the microphone. Thank you. And thinking outside the box, maybe we could think sort of very broadly. I'm going to go for a lady first. Zoe there, thank you. And I'll try and go female, male, if I can.
Hi, Zoe Davis, Wildlife and Countryside Link. We're a coalition of 47 environment and animal welfare NGOs. We heard earlier this week that there are going to be ambitious targets on soil enshrined in the agriculture bill. And I was wondering, would the panel want to see targets for the other public goods that are mentioned in the command paper, including, woodland, biodiversity, animal welfare? Would you want to see targets for those enshrined in the agriculture bill, or do you see them, being covered elsewhere?
Anybody want to answer that? James, you were talking about a target already. I mean, how would we?
Yeah, I think we need to sort of continue with the direction that the command paper takes us in. I think the targets perhaps more sit within an Environment Act that will give us clarity about what we're all striving for. And obviously, from the point of view of my organisation, we'd like to see a woodland creation target, but there should also be targets, I think, in there for species recovery as well, and soil, perhaps coming through in the environment one as much as the agriculture paper. And also, I think a very strong theme of the conference so far is about access to nature and reconnecting children with nature. So I think something around increased opportunities for access would be quite good, and could bring on board some of the public health organisations, which was a lot of lobbying clout.
But one of the risks of the environment bill and paper and whatever comes next is coming well after the command paper that we've got now. Isn't there a risk that we put in place measures within the Act and elsewhere that don't fit with the environment?
It is a risk, and soil's probably an obvious area there. Really. How you see it, really, whether you see the agriculture paper as the framework, and the Environment Act as
okay, so but it's got to be
the driver for years hence.
It's got to be anticipated in there, maybe. Yes.
Yeah.
Anybody else, Tim?
Well, only potentially that this emphasises this disconnect, and we can set all the targets we like in environment paper for farm and birds, for instance, but unless we solve the problem of increased production and productivity on that land, which is going to be able to need to be farmed harder and faster in order to increase productivity, unless there's a connection between the two, there is pointless pointless setting targets. So, should we be doing these things separately in the same way as should we be having the debate? So.
It'd be interesting if anybody wants to ask about productivity. Well, how do we define it? But anybody else want to answer that question?
Can I just say one thing as well about soils and soil conservation? There are some things that are happening now that are very big wrongs. And the growing of maize in the upper catchment of river systems where the soil lies open all winter and where guys have to go in with 360s and basically pull their tractors out by the time they finish cultivation is just a wrong. I mean, the increase in production of this single crop is doing huge damage, and really the government need to look at how we go about just stopping it.
So rather than
It
a
makes
target,
very
a ban.
It's
particular places.
maybe a sentient thinking ban, but we need to look very clearly at how we're going to determine what kind of planning strategy we apply to a landscape. After the Second World War, it was decided that planning was not appropriate for agriculture, but look at where we are now.
Yeah. So bringing
Was that
planning
wise?
into it, yeah,
Maybe.
good. Phil, comment on this.
I think that it's important to have a range of targets. It's also important to recognise the interconnectivity of these things. It's going to be very difficult to meaningfully hit regeneration targets for soils unless we have a systemic change, unless we move away from industrial agriculture. I certainly favour an approach where we should legislate against some of the worst practices and set incentives and targets to move to better and best practices. And I know there's been some talk in the domain this morning about public money for public goods and for the paying farmers to keep tails on pigs, which is an interesting one. And I just want to tackle that, if I may, because paying farmers subsidy money, public money to stop routine tail docking is a conundrum. It's not one that I go along with, and I tell you for why. Because the routine tail docking of pigs in Britain and Europe today is illegal. Yeah. What we should be doing is dealing with that problem through enforcement and using public money for systemic change.
Okay. Managed to get tails into a target question there. Well done, Phil.
Thank you.
This gentleman there.
Dominic Caith, Environment Agency. I wanted to pick up on your point, Philip, about grazing and the idea of extensive grazing now. I think that's an interesting idea, and from an ecological perspective, as an ecologist, I think there's mileage in that, but you've got to get the stocking density right, you've got to get the locations and the species, potentially not the species, the varieties right. And you can do some fantastic things, as some of the work on the NEP estate that you may be aware of has shown. But there's a scalability issue there, inevitably. So has anyone done the maths to see how much less meat people would have to eat in order to be able to do that?
Well, there's a number of studies that have been done on overall meat consumption, and I think one of the clear things which is coming out is that if we carry on eating meat as we are, as a global community, then our food alone will get us to catastrophic climate change. So a number of organisations, there is a groundswell of opinion that meat and dairy consumption needs to drop quite drastically by at least 50% in the coming couple of decades. But in terms of space, because that was the nub of what you were getting at the moment we're sharing our cereals. We're growing cereals in this country, soya and other things in other countries, in vast chemical-soaked prairies. In this country, half of our cereals are fed to farm animals. And in terms of efficiency, there is none. For every 100 units of protein or calories that we feed to those farm animals, they return somewhere in the region of 30% to 10%, depending on where you're looking at, which isn't a very good deal. And I remember one government official putting it in these terms, which is that anyone who thinks that that's a good deal, give me your wallet with £100 in it and I'll give it back to you with 30. And that is essentially what industrial livestock does for us. On the space thing, I've run the maths on chickens, because the usual refrain is if you let all the chickens out, we'll be knee deep in them. Well, I've run the maths, and 1 acre in 1,000 is all we would need to devote to keep the entire UK meat chicken flock, that's nearly a billion birds produced a year, on EU standard free range.
Does that include their feed? or you're not including the feed in
That's
it?
the
Separate.
birds.
Yeah, so the bird in terms of land take for pasture birds. Does anybody else
Pasture
want
birds.
to quick come on that? Or we should-
There are also some interesting hiccups in this as well, because if you're looking at something like free-range beef production, you take the Nepcastle estate out of the equation and you say, right, okay, look, let's go back in time 50 years. Were we getting beef from the uplands then? The answer is yes. But these were things like Galloway bullocks, shorthorn bullocks, things that were, they were like 6, 7 years old by the time the animals were killed. These cattle can produce excellent beef, very high quality beef to a very high welfare animal standard. But the way that we're so structured at the moment legalistically because of BSE is that these cattle have to be dead by 30 months. And the ambition in farming is that you don't keep something for 6 years anymore. You're trying to finish that within 24 months. And that's where your cereal production comes in.
Okay. The next question, is there any female? Oh, yeah, there's a lady at the back there.
Crudely.
Belinda. Then I'll
Belinda Gordon from the Campaign to Protect Rural England. This is a fascinating discussion and just highlights how land is a really valuable finite resource. And there's been mention of the planning system, but I wonder if the panellists had ideas about what we can do to make sure that that limited resource is used better. I've got a slight plug to make. At the CPRE stand outside, we've got a small pamphlet called Landlines, which talks about this issue and about the land use strategy that they've got in Scotland to try to make sure land is used better. But I'm not sure that's been a sort of fantastic success. But I'd be interested in ideas to, we've got to get multiple benefits from our land, and at the moment that isn't happening as well as it could, and what we can do to make sure we solve the housing crisis, are able to produce more food, are able to produce a better environment.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to come
Well,
on?
I do think we need to start by being realistic about demand. And we take all your points about the £30, but the fact is it's £30 that tastes good to the consumer at the moment, and it is the consumer who's driving that. And in the short term, at least, that's not going to fundamentally change when we look at post-Brexit agricultural policy and how we do that. So we are going to have to intensify in some areas if we are going to be able to provide the public goods in terms of biodiversity, which we want to in others. And there's going to be stark choices. It's going to be really stark choices. And we can talk about chemical farming, but we will need to, in some degree, unless we're going to go down the GM route, and I'm not starting on that debate, or unless as well. And if we're accepting, we accept that, we end up, to an extent, we will end up in that ghetto situation where we are choosing which parts of the countryside can be managed to improve biodiversity, how the communities that are there can be engaged in that. From my point of view, that's absolutely critical. Remembering, and it's a really critical point, that when we talk about public goods, the places people want to go tend to be those which have been actively managed, which are obviously created by generations of the rural community. You look at the Lake District, you look at the Brecon, you look at places like that. So how do we integrate that and bring those farmers into that discussion? And that's the thing that worries me most. They'll come with that. They'll go with that. There are all sorts of possibilities there, as well as you accept, as well as you start from a point where you define your outcome. What do you want? If you want more biodiversity, that's that. Engage the community, but you will have to accept that we can use all the emotive language we like about chemical prairies, but you will have to accept that we're going to have to be more intensive in some areas in order to be able to produce the level of food we need for a growing world population.
James, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think it's not just an environment agriculture issue, it demonstrates how much this is a cross-government matter, and the planning system is such an important tool in all this. So if we're talking about nature's recovery and a healthier environment, you've got to start by properly securing that which is irreplaceable. So strengthening protection for ancient woodland is absolutely fundamental, for example, in that regard. And we had the new draft of the National Planning Policy Framework out last week, and that looks like a big step forward in that regard, but it didn't strengthen protection for aged and veteran trees, which we want to see that take place over the next few weeks. So that's got to be a really key driver and a really important start.
That's that planning, new planning for all of Britain? Sorry, I'm not covering
this is in England, the National Planning Policy Framework,
okay.
Yeah. The other big point was also about infrastructure, because there's some big questions about how we want to be as a society bound up with that as well. Whether sticking in HS2 through an awful lot of ancient woodland really is making a really good statement about what kind of country we want to be in the future, and if the environment really is at the heart of that.
Does anybody else want to say anything on planning? No? Okay, both of you.
Can I just say something very quickly about housing? I farm, but my farm is not profitable. And I guess the only reason we hang on to it is because of nostalgia. I like the people I employ, I like their children, and I don't really at this point in time want to make them redundant now. But one of the other things I do is I'm an ecological consultant. Does anybody know here what a brownfield site actually looks like? So all the time we talk about building on brownfields. Do you know what that means? That means you're dealing with sites where farming has gone, where there are black redstarts, where there are galleries of orchids, where there are water voles, where there are dormice, where there are bee wolves, where there is the most amazing variety of life. And our planning policy right now, guys, is eradicating these. So when we start to talk about green belts and planning housing in the green belt, I have difficulty with seeing why we can't do it, because if it's chemical arable agriculture, nothing lives in these environments anyway. I don't see why people shouldn't have a decent house. I don't see why they should be forced into inner cities. I can't see why they couldn't have some chickens and a garden. I think it would be easier to plan plan housing in some of these areas. I think it'd be more accessible. You could build schools, you can build access routes of arterial roads. Frankly, with caveats, I have no problem with it at all. And I do think this is not a simplistic argument, but it's something we do need to think
So
about.
what you're saying, protect the brownfield, some of the good brownfield, by building on the intensively farmed land?
If you want a crude
Yeah.
answer,
Okay.
yes.
Can I
Just to make it a
Jump in on
group.
Happily.
I think the thing about the green...
Phil's coming in the next, sorry.
I think in terms of optimal land use, I think we should avoid monocultures in all of their forms, and one of those is having a field of cows, extensively or otherwise, that are just a field of cows. Why not run the chickens with them, as an example? I think the other point that I'd like to pick up on is Tim's point about feeding a growing world population. We've got 7.5 billion people on the planet right now, soon be 10 billion. I've run the numbers, and globally we already produce enough food globally to feed up to 16 billion people. That's not to say that 16 billion people would be a good idea, it would not. But it's to say that actually, if we stopped wasting so much food, and the biggest form of food waste on the planet is in feeding human edible crops to industrially reared animals, factory farmed animals. If we stopped that, then we could feed everyone now and in the future using less land, not more.
Okay, point made. But you also made the point about multifunctional use of land, mixing up diversity, etc., in the cropping and the livestock and mixed farming, I assume. James, sorry, quickly.
Yeah, just quickly on the green belt, really. I think one of the things that needs to happen is it needs to be made a lot greener. And therefore far more meaningful to the ordinary taxpayer, really. And Dieter Hellman, the Natural Capital Committee, have been really strong on this for a number of years, really, calling for the targeting of new woodland creation close to communities where it would deliver maximum social benefit. So I think making the green belt greener ought to be one of the main drivers.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here was next in the queue. Sorry, I should have told you. I hope somebody's going to tell me when we have to stop, because we could talk forever, can't we?
Hi, Steve Newman from Biodiversity International Limited. For me, one of the greatest benefits of coming out of the CAP is that agroforestry will not be still illegal. So now we've got an incredible potential to review how we use trees in land use. I'd like to ask the panel, particularly in relation to its links with rewilding, with animal welfare, and also reaching our sequestration targets for increased woodiness in the UK, what the panel think about agroforestry.
Specifically agroforestry,
Yes.
not forestry in
Yes.
general. It is absent from the command paper, largely, which is a disappointment. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Just quickly jump down that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think agroforestry is an idea whose time has come. And it's slightly odd that it didn't feature in the command paper, because there has been a bit of momentum building up around it. And the Woodland Trust, we have a network of farm ambassadors who are actually showcasing agroforestry. And as part of the consultation roadshow that's taking place around the command paper, Stephen Briggs, one of our farm ambassadors in Cambridgeshire, is hosting an agroforestry workship in a few weeks' time.
Right.
Sorry.
Tim.
No.
A slightly random point, but it is connected. Stay with me. I think there is a fundamental issue about the ownership of land and why people own land, which has a direct impact on people's investment in things like forestry as well. And there is, it is. In my part of the world, in Hertfordshire, farmland isn't for sale. when it goes up. It's an agricultural investment. That's what the sign says. And there is a huge amount of land which is currently in the hands of people who hold it for the purpose of that investment rather than for a long-term benefit. This isn't a romantic thing about small farms or big farms. This is about why you hold that land. And a land ownership pattern where land is held as an asset, where there's short-term farm business tenancies, and then contractors who are farming that land, everyone working to a very fine margin, probably having more impact on biodiversity than all the policy, than all the policy that government, the CAP and government passed last year. So I think that's something that is often unspoken, and there are probably people here who don't want me to mention things like inheritance tax relief.
I was going to say, what's your solution to that?
It is about the tax system. Why is land owned? Is it that owned by people to farm? Or is it owned by people who purely as an investment? And is that wrong? I don't know. But it is. I am absolutely certain it's having a significant effect on the landscape, on biodiversity.
Okay,
More
agroforestry.
trees would help with inheritance.
And just to come back, and I'm sure you're quite right, but agroforestry is not an old idea. Agroforestry is wood pasture. You go to Extremadura, you go to Portugal, you go to Spain, you see the cork oak, you see the holm oak there, you see the cattle grazing under it, you see the pigs, you see the flock of sort of azure magpies, of the hoopoes dancing from tree to tree. It's an excellent idea. How do we make it work? We have a bizarre relationship in this country with trees. You go to agricultural college, and they will tell you if you've got big oaks still standing in your arable fields, and there may be an issue about taking them down, or they've got TPO on them, what you do is plough as near to the base as you can. You get under that canopy with a tractor and you destroy those roots, and eventually they'll fall over. So we're going to have to rethink our relationship with trees. And yes, it does mean agroforestry is long-term thinking, not the short-term type of thinking when it comes to land use you're talking about.
Okay, Phil, do you still want to come in, or quickly?
I think agroforestry has huge potential. And I think that it recognises some of the natural habitats for our farm animals. Pigs, mother pigs, for example, would rather not have their piglets in crates where they can't turn around for weeks at a time and are made to face the wall. They would rather have their piglets in wooded forestry edges. Similarly, hens would much rather not be in cages where they can't flap their wings, and would much rather be under trees which ape their natural habitat, which is forests in Southeast Asia.
So that multifunctional thing again.
Absolutely multifunctional.
Which, if anybody was around for the Cork Declaration under Franz Fischler, they might remember that. This gentleman here. So Nick, no, it's here. Sorry, here. Any women who want to ask a question? Okay, I've got somebody at that.
Yeah, Nick Lampkin from the Organic Research Centre. There's been quite an interesting discussion, but to me there is a fundamental issue here about whether, in order to change our land use, we try and separate biodiversity from agriculture.
The land sharing,
the land sharing sparing type argument. I can fully accept that there are areas where we need to have agriculture taken out in order for certain species to be able to thrive. That for me is not a problem whatsoever. But for most of what we value about farmed species that are disappearing, it is the close integration of biodiversity and farming together that is critical. And what I really do not like the look of is the whole idea that we go for some sort of biodiversity sacrifices areas where we intensify production to make it as strong as possible. We need to be looking at redesigning systems to reintegrate biodiversity so that the biodiversity is also helping make better farming systems.
Yeah. I get the impression that that kind of debate has moved on, and we are talking about it, but
I was reflecting on some of the things that Tim Bonner was saying about needing to intensify in certain areas.
Tim,
I don't accept that.
Comment on that?
I mean, it's not a proproposal. It's just it's the fact that there is a discussion, and it's what you have to sacrifice. And if we're, I mean, the paradox that many of the species which we are most concerned about, whether it's the curlew or whatever else, are species of a farmed environment, and even recreating that environment, is that going to put farmers in those communities in a place where they're not sustainable, and that's so you have to sustain it some other way. But
can I just say as well, it is not a straightforward. There's no straightforward answer to that. If you take it to a species level, there are species that could live quite happily through the landscapes we have, existing in them and coping with them as are. When you talk about curlews, they're a bird of a lost landscape. And when you look at our farm, and we try hard, we have corridors, we have lots of pool systems, we are planting more woodland, more trees from Dartmoor. But where the sheep are uneconomic anyway, but where the sheep are, nothing lives. It's as simple as that. Nothing lives. There are a few flocks of meadow pipits passing through. When the weather gets very cold and the beast from the east blows in, we have lapwings. Maybe with this year we had a flock of 150 lapwings. I have no idea where those birds are breeding, but it's not in Britain. And it's not anywhere near us. They may be from Brittany. So I think we're going to have a significant element of separating nature from farming, because if we do, it will be a picture that's more complex than that. But the idea that we could do it all sympatrically together without going back to the time of the horse is in reality just simply not realistic.
Okay. Well, you've got some opinions there. You've got the question at the back.
Thanks. It's Laura Mackenzie from the Soil Association. I was wondering what the panel think about whether there is enough debate, both in this kind of conference and more generally, around the role of pesticides and agrochemicals. So partly, obviously, a lot of good work has been done by organic and non-organic farmers to reduce pesticide use, but are we doing enough, not just because of the impacts on biodiversity and insect life, but also because of the impacts on soil health, and actually also because of public health, which is something that feels like it needs to come into the debate around the future of land use. And looking at other EU countries, they seem to be doing more in terms of, some of them anyway, on pesticide regulation, on organic farming, on agroecological methods. So I suppose there's a kind of checking our evidence base for when we're pointing fingers at the CAP for why we're not doing more there. But yeah, so it'd be great to hear the panel's view on pesticides and agrochemicals.
Okay, who wants to take that? Yeah, Phil?
I think there's nowhere near enough debate about the role of those things, pesticides and agrochemicals. I think they are the instrumentation of annihilation in the countryside as far as biodiversity is concerned, as far as our natural capital, if we want to put it that way, in terms of the ecosystem that we need as a society to thrive into the future. So I think the sooner that we have that debate and the sooner we move away systemically from industrial agriculture in both its forms, because it comes in two sides, and they're both very much linked. The first side is where the farm animals go, off of pastures, out of woodland edges, into cages, crates and confinement, and then we have vast acreages of chemical-soaked prairies that are rearing their food either in this country or on continents abroad. And then we waste the vast majority of the food value in feeding it to those farm animals to produce a so-called cheap, but actually, in terms of externalities, hugely expensive, poor quality in terms of health, welfare, environment product that actually tastes pretty ropey too.
Okay. Does anybody else want pesticides? Anybody comment on that?
One of the issues we have with this is you start off in your career as a young farmer, okay, you go to agricultural college. Your agricultural college courses there might be an odd afternoon where they talk about biodiversity. You might have somebody wander in from the EA to talk about flooding and silt containment. But the bulk of your course is you are there to farm, and you are sponsored, with all due respect, by the big chemical companies commonly. And when you leave that college, you go into a workplace with your father or your uncle, and they take their advice not from an independent advisor, but from old Fred, who turns up in a Ford Cortina and tells them that on those fields they need to put 4 ton of nitrogen, or they need to spray this crop off with that. We are the big hairy pink apes that are eating all this crap. At the end of the day, all the ivermectins that go into the cattle, all the chemicals that are sprayed on the crops, we're the end consumer. Should we be worried about it? Yes, I think we should be very worried about it. At the end of it all, we're the end consumer.
Okay.
Could I just quickly on that, because I am way beyond my expertise. But I see farmers who I look up to, who look to be doing a good job. We were talking about soil earlier. The glyphosate no-till debate for a moment. I mean, I am well beyond, but I don't know whether the argument that they put, that without glyphosate they would have to plough, there would be more problems with soil. Is that something that you accept at all?
Well, what I do know is that there's a great example of a farm at scale in Hampshire, not far from me. It's 10 times bigger than the UK average farm, and it was wall-to-wall cereal cropping, wall-to-wall arable. It was essentially treated with 9 different chemical applications for every harvest, costing £700 in chemicals per hectare. And what the farmer found, a guy called Tim May, he found that his his yields were dropping. It didn't matter how much he used his chemicals. What was happening was his soils were tired. So what did he do? He left the chemicals in the barn and he reintroduced farm animals, cattle, sheep, and then pigs and chickens on a rotational basis, and not using the chemicals, and rotating with those crops. His yields have come back. His cattle and sheep are fed purely pasture-based. They're not fed a single grain. And the system has had biodiversity flooding back as well as soil fertility.
It's worth Googling that. Tim May is I've seen a film of that. It's a good example of reintroducing.
Profile of agroecology.
Sorry?
His profile of
agroecology. So have a look at that. It is a very interesting one. James?
Just briefly, sort of pick up on
Okay.
on Derek's point, really. I think the quality of advice available to land managers needs to be a real kind of priority focus in the future, really.
Okay, yeah. There's a gentleman over there, and then I'll come down here, and then we probably have to wrap up.
Hi, Ben Goldsmith. I'm actually one of the organisers, so I was tempted to ask about
Hi, Ben.
lunch.
Sorry, I didn't. Yeah.
I guess people are looking forward to their lunch. I have a question in respect of public goods, and we've heard a lot of the consensus amongst pretty much everyone from left to right, rural, urban, that public money really should be used to buy public goods from land managers, and a shift away from either land-based or production-based subsidies. My worry is that public goods will be confused with public bads. We are the least forested nation in Europe, about 10 or 11% versus an average of nearly 40% on the continent. And that's principally because we subsidise huge numbers of sheep in the uplands. And for anyone who's visited the uplands, there is, of course, a cultural quaintness and a cultural value to those sheep farming landscapes. But you'll see more wildlife in Berkeley Square on a sunny afternoon than you will in a 3-hour walk in most of the Lake District or the Highlands of Scotland or the Yorkshire Dales. And so my worry is that these denuded landscapes, which deliver really kind of cycles of flooding and drought in the lowlands and not much in the way of wildlife and biodiversity, have come to be treasured by a population that's kind of brainwashed in a way that this is what beauty is, of ecological beauty is. And do we think that continued subsidies for sheep farming will be handed out post-Brexit because of that?
Okay, it's a direct question there. Obviously, there's an impact on land use. It's a big impact on land use, what we're using it for. Should we pay for it, as it is now?
I'm a sheep farmer. Can I say
Oh,
something?
yes, okay.
Thank
I'll
you
go all
very
of
much,
you.
the audience, for giving me £17,000 a year of your money so I can blow it in a new Land Rover because I'm pissed off with the colour I bought last year. At the end of the day, it is a ridiculous waste of money. And just to finish on the agri-forestry thing, you know, there's another relationship we have with trees, and it's called swaling in the uplands. And it's where the cows would like to go and have their calves in the forest, but we burn all the forest down. No, it's ridiculous. We need to look at using the landscape in a different way.
But it's what we use that £17,000 for, isn't it? You know, if that £17,000 was targeted at you to farm in a way which generated biodiversity, did the things that Ben wants you to do, get the birds, the rest of it, then that provides a public good.
I agree with that, but you know, the one thing I would say, and I love my neighbours, when we go to the pub in the evening, they're very funny men, they're a robust community of guys. If your car failed at 2 o'clock in the morning, they would come out and help you. I like them and admire them as a bunch of men. But they have no concept of biodiversity, and very few of them have any interest in it.
But that could
at all.
change. That could change. It could change. And I think that's the point of the public goods.
£17,000, what do you use it for?
It's one of the journeys we're going to have to make.
Yeah.
And John touched on it earlier when he talked to how you start to reorganise farms and retire people and put them somewhere else. But you're going to have to look at possibly a generational change, because these guys have lived with CAP all their lives. They're 65, 67 years old. Would you want to enter a brave new world at that age?
But that change needs to happen.
Well, the answer is...
You don't, but their sons,
Okay.
their sons
Okay.
might.
Okay.
Their sons might. And there is, that's the leverage, that's the way
Exactly.
forward.
And
Ben,
the public
Ben, we're
needs
going
to
to the
change.
uplands and I'll show you some birds, okay?
And the public baseline can change about what they like up there, I guess, as well. James, quickly.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think John Varley from Clinton Devon Estates made a very good point this morning during the plenary about landowners who are up for it but not ready for it yet. So I think really working with them and strengthening that quality of advice that's available to them seems to be a priority. We can move to that, what Ben's describing.
That might need some funding. It might need
Absolutely.
support. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Phil, quickly. And then we've got one more question very, very quickly after that.
So very quickly, Ben, you would expect me, of course, to be in favour of sheep free-ranging. I would much rather see them free-ranging on lowland rotational farms, mixed rotational farms in the lowlands, than having the uplands being denuded by free-range sheep and the lowlands denuded by intensive arable crops. Let's have a mix, let's have it in the lowlands, let's do it right, and I believe that public money should be used to drive those public goods.
Did you want to quickly, you could be very quick. Sorry, you've been waiting patiently.
My name's Lorraine Platt and I'm the co-founder of the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. Now we campaign to show the impact of intensive farming on animal welfare, the environment and public health. How can we encourage farmers to move away from intensive systems where farm animals often have very little quality of life to move around and to have natural behaviours?
Okay, if I could ask you all to answer that question, then give it any wider points you might want to make specifically about land and global land use, taking it right from the farm up to global. Phil, do you want to start?
I think that we should use public money to incentivise moving to free-range rotational systems. I think we should have honest labelling, that there should be mandatory labelling according to method of production so that consumers are not blindfolded into thinking that fresh means free range when actually it means fresh from the factory farm. And we should have bold government legislation which actually takes out of the equation cages and crates. The other format, the other aspect that we like to work on is working with corporations, McDonald's, Tesco's of the world, to create the market with no holds barred by moving solely to cage-free eggs as an example.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I think, again, agroforestry is a helpful way forward in this area, and some of our farm ambassadors are working from an animal welfare-driven perspective. Did you want us to make some concluding remarks as well?
Yes, if you can.
Yeah, just 3 very quick points, really. I think we need to really follow through on the trajectory of the Agriculture Command paper, make sure it's not one of those consultations that kind of withers and doesn't deliver in the end. We need a bold Environment Act that gives us all clarity about what we're striving for. And finally, just a plea. I mean, it's difficult to think of a policy area where there's more of a disconnect between the evidence base and the reality than tree planting. It's, you know, one barely goes to a conference nowadays where the benefits of trees, an environmental conference where the benefits of trees are not listed. Yet we have these pathetic planting rates that we've got to turn around. And I know Michael Gove acknowledges they're very poor, but that's got to be a big priority, I think, in the future.
Okay.
To Lorraine, profit. Simple. Yeah, it's not a dirty word. If people can make a profit, they will use that system. And we can't run away from that. We have to be realistic about it. It's about profit. And in terms of the wider question, yeah, we've heard from Philip, who wants to tell people what they can eat, and I'm being completely. And we turn Ben. You know, Ben's told us what sort of landscape people are going to like. The fact is, at the moment, whether we're right or wrong, whether you're right or wrong, the fact is, at the moment, they want to eat shite chicken from a broiler shed, and they want to walk in the Lake District, and that's not going to change in the next 2 years.
It's already changing. It has to be said, the trends are in the other direction. But yeah, sorry, I interrupt you. But there are trends.
There are trends, but yeah, essentially that is the basis of demand as it is at the moment.
It is there,
We've got to be realistic about that. Yeah, we can move that. We can move that by offering people opportunity to make a profit using a system which is a higher welfare system, which is a more benefit to biodiversity. But we can't think that we're going to turn that in overnight, and we've got to move Derek's friends slowly because they ain't going to come fast.
Thank you.
You know, it's actually
Derek.
a really difficult and a really complex question. Profit, you're right, profit's part of it hugely. If we want to pay as consumers for Daisy the cow stand in a meadow with its other short-corn coloured counterparts around it, munching on long grass, living until they're in their early 20s, then we're going to have to pay more for that milk. If we want to have our milk at whatever pathetic price it is, and it's going to have to be produced by Holstein Friesians standing in sheds because they've no back fat cover and they can't stand the weather, and their hips give in when they're 2 or at a very young age, they're infertile, after they've had their second calf, they have a miserable, short, horrid, pathetic life, then pay for your cheap milk. It's as simple as that. It's how do we gear this? I don't know, but it's an eternal problem. And then the other thing, just if we want a final finishing point, just to catch up on, is that in all the time we've talked about single farm payment, and all the time we've talked about using public money to support this industry, the debate that has never been openly had is what that money's for. If you turned around to people on the street and said, look, you have a choice. You can use this money to poison Lincolnshire, to poison the rivers and the streams, to put the pesticides and the silts, the toxic chemicals chemicals into there, or you can use your whatever you pay as a taxpayer, your £400 a household, to create a landscape that's rich in skylarks, that's got kites flying over it. Every so often an eagle comes down and pinches one of my sheep and I'm pissed off with it. But at the end of it all, you have a choice. We have never asked them. And maybe that's what we're coming to now.
Thank you very much, Derek. And that's a good point to end, because we need to get people, the public and everybody in this room and everybody to respond to the consultation, the Health and Harmony consultation that DEFRA's put out. But I think also the point about the market paying, I mean, that's something I work on a lot at Sustain, trying to claw some of the profits that go right up to the top and shareholders of the big food companies down, so farmers can actually do the right thing and can do what they want to do for animals, the environment. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for our speakers?